Dear friends, after a tiring and stressful day, welcome to Mysterious Sleep Stories. Tonight we embark on a journey to one of America's most fascinating and eerie places, a structure that is both a monument to hope and proof of the darkness that can spring from even the most well-meaning dreams. Settle into your bed, snuggle under your blankets, and let the day's worries fade into the background as I journey with you to a fortress-like structure on Fairmount Avenue in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is a place where 30-foot-high stone walls have witnessed unimaginable suffering, where isolation has been elevated to an art form, and where the ghosts of the past refuse to remain silent. This is the Eastern State Penitentiary, which once represented humanity's boldest experiment in criminal reform, but has transformed into a cautionary tale about the fine line between enlightenment and cruelty. Tonight's story is not just about a prison. This is about ambition, about society's eternal struggle to strike a balance between punishment and atonement, and about the echoes that linger when we dare to look into the darkest corners of the human experience. So close your eyes, relax, and let me take you on a journey through corridors where footsteps still echo, whispers emanate from long-abandoned cells, and the weight of history presses down on you like the hand of time. But first, let's go back to the beginning, to the years after America's Revolution, when a young nation dared to imagine that things could be done differently. The vision, birth of a revolutionary idea. Picture Philadelphia in the years following the American Revolution. The cobblestone streets still bear the marks of British occupation, and the air itself seems charged with the electricity of possibility. This is a city, a nation really, that has just thrown off the shackles of monarchy and declared to the world that all men are created equal, that they possess certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there's a problem, and it's one that gnaws at the conscience of the city's most progressive minds. While America has proclaimed liberty for all, its prisons tell a different story. They're hellholes, really, places where human beings are packed together like cattle, where disease runs rampant, where the strong prey upon the weak, and where any notion of rehabilitation is completely absent. These aren't institutions of justice. They're warehouses of human misery, no better than the dungeons of the old world that America's founders claim to have left behind. In these prisons, men, women, and children are crammed into common rooms without separation by age, gender, or the severity of their crimes. A teenage boy arrested for stealing bread might find himself locked in the same space as a hardened murderer. Women are routinely assaulted. Disease spreads unchecked. Starvation is common. And guards, when they're not accepting bribes or joining in the abuse, simply look the other way. The concept of reform doesn't exist. These places exist solely to warehouse the unwanted until their trials, and if convicted, until their executions or until disease claims them first. The conditions are so appalling that they've caught the attention of some of Philadelphia's most prominent citizens. These are men steeped in Enlightenment philosophy, believers in reason, progress, and the perfectibility of mankind. They've read John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They understand that society is a contract, and that even those who break its laws remain human beings, endowed by their Creator with dignity that shouldn't be stripped away simply because they've committed a crime. On May 8th, 1787, just weeks before delegates would gather to draft the United States Constitution, a group of these concerned Philadelphians met at Benjamin Franklin's house. The setting was appropriate. Franklin, then 81 years old, and one of the nation's most revered elder statesmen, had long championed the causes of education, science, and social progress. His home, with its clever inventions and extensive library, embodied the Enlightenment spirit that animated this gathering. The men who assembled that day included Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and one of the nation's most prominent physicians. Rush was a complex figure, a man of genuine compassion who nonetheless held some views that seem misguided by modern standards. But his heart was in the right place. He believed passionately that crime was a disease, a moral sickness that could be cured through proper treatment. The key, he argued, was isolation. Not the chaotic, violent isolation of being thrown into a pit with dozens of other desperate criminals, but peaceful, contemplative solitude. Rush had been influenced by the writings of John Howard, an English philanthropist who had toured prisons throughout Europe and been horrified by what he'd seen. Howard advocated for what seemed like radical ideas. That prisoners should be kept separate from one another, that they should be given productive work to do, that their environment should be clean and healthy, and that the ultimate goal should be their reformation, not their destruction. Also present at that fateful meeting was Bishop William White, the first Episcopal bishop of Pennsylvania and a man of considerable spiritual authority. White brought a religious dimension to the discussion. He spoke of redemption, of the possibility that even the worst sinner could be brought back into God's grace through sincere repentance. But repentance, White argued, required reflection, and reflection required solitude. A man surrounded by the chaos and corruption of a traditional prison could never achieve the spiritual awakening necessary for true reform. These men, along with others including prominent lawyers, merchants, and civic leaders, formed what they called the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. The name was deliberately chosen. They weren't simply calling for better prisons. They were calling for an entirely new approach to criminal justice, one that acknowledged that prisons, as currently conceived, created misery rather than alleviating it. The Society's first order of business was to advocate for reforms at the Walnut Street Jail, Philadelphia's main detention facility. They pushed for the segregation of prisoners by sex and by the severity of their crimes. They advocated for the creation of workshops where inmates could learn useful trades. They fought to end the worst abuses, the selling of alcohol to prisoners, the acceptance of bribes by guards, the practice of chaining inmates to walls like animals. And they proposed something revolutionary, a separate wing where the most serious offenders would be held in complete solitary confinement. No contact with other prisoners. No visitors except the warden. No books except the Bible. Nothing but silence, solitude, and the weight of their own consciences. In 1790, the Pennsylvania legislature authorized these reforms, and a portion of the Walnut Street Jail was converted to implement what became known as the Pennsylvania system. The results were, at least initially, encouraging. Prisoners held in solitary confinement did seem more subdued, more contemplative. There were fewer violent incidents. The facility ran more smoothly. But there was also a problem that would plague the system from its inception. It was expensive. Each prisoner required his own cell, his own exercise yard, his own guard. The costs quickly mounted. Moreover, the Walnut Street Jail was never designed for this kind of operation. It was an old building, cramped and inefficient. As Philadelphia's population boomed in the early 1800s, driven by immigration and westward expansion, the jail became impossibly overcrowded. By 1820, It housed nearly 400 prisoners in a facility designed for maybe 150. The Pennsylvania system, which required complete separation of inmates, simply couldn't function under these conditions. Prisoners had to double up in cells. They worked together in common areas. The dream of transformative solitude gave way to the brutal reality of overcrowding. The Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons refused to give up on their vision, though. If the Walnut Street Jail couldn't accommodate the Pennsylvania system, they argued then Pennsylvania needed to build a facility that could. They needed to build not just a larger jail, but an entirely new kind of structure, one designed from the ground up to facilitate the system of separate confinement they believed would revolutionize criminal justice. For more than a decade, they lobbied the state legislature. They published pamphlets. They gave speeches. They brought in experts from around the world to testify about the successes of similar systems in Europe. And finally, in 1821, their persistence paid off. The Pennsylvania legislature appropriated $100,000, an absolutely staggering sum for the time, to construct what would be called the Eastern State Penitentiary. The location chosen was a cherry orchard on the outskirts of Philadelphia, in an area known as Cherry Hill. It was far enough from the city center to be affordable and to provide room for expansion, but close enough that staff and supplies could be easily transported. The site covered about 10 acres, large enough for the ambitious structure the society envisioned. Now, they needed an architect, someone who could translate their philosophical ideals into stone and mortar. A competition was announced, and two prominent architects submitted designs. William Strickland, a well-known Philadelphia architect who had designed the Second Bank of the United States, and John Haviland, a British-trained architect who had immigrated to America just a few years earlier. Haviland's design was chosen, and for his efforts, he received a prize of $100. It seems almost comically small now, but in 1821, it was considered generous compensation. More importantly, Haviland understood what the Philadelphia Society wanted. He wasn't just designing a building. He was designing a machine for moral reformation, a structure whose very architecture would guide prisoners toward penitence and redemption. The word penitentiary itself was new. It derived from penitent, someone who repents of their sins. This wouldn't be a prison in the old sense, a place of punishment and despair. It would be a penitentiary, a place where criminals would be moved to genuine remorse, where they would confront the gravity of their actions in the silence of their cells, and where they would emerge after serving their sentences as reformed citizens ready to rejoin society. It was an audacious dream, born of Enlightenment optimism and Quaker spirituality. The Quakers, though often credited with creating the Pennsylvania system, were actually just one voice among many in the Philadelphia Society. But their influence was undeniable. The Quaker emphasis on the inner light, the belief that God speaks directly to each individual's conscience, aligned perfectly with the theory behind solitary confinement. Remove all external distractions, the theory went, and a man would have no choice but to listen to that inner voice, to confront his sins, and to seek redemption. What the founders of Eastern State Penitentiary didn't fully understand, what they couldn't understand given the limited psychological knowledge of their era, was that the human mind isn't designed for prolonged isolation, that solitude, extended beyond a certain point, doesn't lead to enlightenment. It leads to madness. That the inner voice, when it's the only voice a person hears for months or years on end, doesn't speak words of wisdom and redemption. It screams, it fractures, it breaks. But in 1821, as construction began on that cherry orchard in Philadelphia, such concerns lay in the future. For now, there was only hope, only the conviction that humanity could do better, that America could lead the way in creating a more humane, more enlightened approach to criminal justice. The foundation was laid. The walls began to rise. And soon, Eastern State Penitentiary would open its doors to its first inmates, beginning an experiment that would influence prison design around the world and create echoes that still resonate today. Let me take you now into the details of what they built, this revolutionary structure that would become both an architectural marvel and a chamber of horrors. Architecture of isolation. John Haviland stood on the cherry orchard site in 1822, watching as workers began excavating the foundation for what would become the most expensive and architecturally ambitious public building in America. At 31 years old, Haviland was relatively young for such a monumental commission, but he possessed a rare combination of technical skill and philosophical understanding. He knew he wasn't just designing a building. He was translating an ideology into physical form. The design that emerged from Haviland's drafting table was unlike anything that had been built before. At its heart was a central hub, a rotunda where guards would be stationed. From this hub radiated 7 corridors, like spokes on a wheel, stretching outward in perfect symmetry. Each corridor, or cell block as they came to be called, was lined on both sides with individual cells. The brilliance of this radial design was its efficiency of observation. A single guard, standing in the central hub, could see down the length of all 7 cell blocks simultaneously. No prisoner could move from his cell without being observed. It was panopticism before Jeremy Bentham's panopticon became famous, an architecture of surveillance disguised as an architecture of reformation. But Haviland's genius extended beyond mere functionality. He understood that a building designed to house criminals needed to make a statement, needed to impress upon both the inmates and the public the seriousness of the law and the consequences of violating it. So while the interior of Eastern State would be designed to inspire reflection and penitence, the exterior would be designed to inspire fear. The perimeter wall rose 30 feet high, constructed of granite blocks so massive that they required teams of horses to move. These weren't the neat, uniform blocks of modern construction. They were rough-hewn, deliberately medieval in appearance, giving the wall a fortress-like quality that seemed to have erupted from the Dark Ages rather than the Age of Enlightenment. The wall stretched for half a mile, enclosing the entire 10-acre site in an unbroken ring of stone. At intervals along the wall, Haviland designed towers, soaring cylindrical structures topped with crenellations like a castle's battlements. These served no practical defensive purpose. Eastern State wasn't expecting to repel an invading army, but the towers sent a message. They said, "Here dwells authority. Here the law is supreme. Approach with caution, for within these walls, the power of the state is absolute." The main entrance, the only break in that half-mile circuit of wall, was designed to be particularly imposing. 2 massive towers flanked a Gothic archway, and above it all rose a central tower that dominated the skyline. The stonework was deliberately rough, with deep recesses that created dramatic shadows. The overall effect was one of grim medievalism, of a structure more suited to housing dragons than reforming criminals. Charles Dickens, visiting in 1842, would compare it to an enchanted castle in a fairy tale, though not a happy fairy tale, more like the kind where children get baked into pies. This contrast between exterior and interior was entirely deliberate. The exterior said, "Justice is implacable. The law cannot be mocked." But the interior was designed to say something different. Redemption is possible. God's grace extends even here. Step through that Gothic archway, past the guards and their checkpoint, and you'd find yourself in a world transformed. The first thing that would strike you was the light. Unlike traditional prisons, which were typically dark, dank dungeons where sunlight never penetrated, Eastern State was flooded with natural light. Haviland had designed each corridor with a vaulted ceiling featuring skylights that allowed daylight to stream in. The effect was deliberately church-like, creating an atmosphere of sacred contemplation rather than secular punishment. The corridors themselves stretched for hundreds of feet, lined with massive wooden doors on both sides. These weren't the iron bar cells of traditional jails where prisoners could see and communicate with each other. These were solid doors, each hiding a separate world, a cell where a single man would spend months or years in complete isolation from his fellow inmates. Let's enter one of these cells and examine what Haviland had created. The cell was small, roughly 12 feet long by 8 feet wide, with a vaulted ceiling that rose to about 16 feet at its highest point. This vaulting was both aesthetically pleasing and functionally important, creating better air circulation and giving the space a cathedral-like quality that reinforced the religious undertones of the Pennsylvania system. High in the wall opposite the door was a single window, an arched opening that allowed sunlight to stream in. This was positioned deliberately out of reach, 10 or 12 feet above the floor, so that a prisoner couldn't use it to communicate with inmates in adjacent cells or to attempt an escape. But it allowed in God's light, the eye of heaven looking down upon the sinner, a constant reminder that even in solitude, the prisoner was not truly alone. Divine judgment was always present. The floor was stone, cold and hard, though prisoners were provided with a mat to sleep on. In one corner was a toilet, a fixture so revolutionary that it bears emphasizing. When Eastern State opened in 1829, it had indoor plumbing in every cell, running water, flushing toilets, central heating. These amenities were so advanced that the White House, home of President Andrew Jackson, wouldn't have similar features for another several years. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. America's criminals were, in purely material terms, better housed than America's president. The heating system was particularly innovative. A coal-fired furnace in the basement sent hot air through a system of ducts that opened into each cell, providing warmth even in the depths of a Philadelphia winter. This wasn't just about comfort, though it certainly was more comfortable than most prisoners of the era could have hoped for. It was about health. The Pennsylvania system required prisoners to be kept alive and relatively healthy if they were going to emerge reformed at the end of their sentences. A prisoner who died of exposure or disease couldn't be reformed. Attached to each cell was a small exercise yard, individual outdoor space about 8 feet wide and 18 feet long, surrounded by walls 10 feet high. Here, a prisoner could walk in circles, breathe fresh air, and see the sky. But he couldn't see beyond his walls, couldn't glimpse any other prisoner, couldn't communicate with anyone. Even in this moment of relative freedom, isolation was maintained. The cells, when construction began in 1822, were designed to hold 250 prisoners in complete separation. Each would have his own cell, his own exercise yard, his own view of heaven through a skylight. They would never see each other's faces, never speak to one another, never corrupt each other through evil conversation or coordinate plans for rebellion. They would be alone with their consciences, with their Bibles, and with God. Construction of this massive project took 7 years and cost far more than the originally appropriated $100,000. By the time the first phase was completed in 1829, the price tag had ballooned to around $780,000, which would be equivalent to roughly $25 million today. It was at that moment the most expensive public building ever constructed in the United States. Only the U.S. Capitol had cost more, and Eastern State was a larger, more complex structure. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Each door had 2 layers, an inner iron grate and an outer wooden panel that slid on tracks. Both could be locked independently, providing redundant security. The locks themselves were marvels of engineering, custom designed with secret mechanisms that made them nearly impossible to pick. Guards wore soft-soled shoes so their footsteps wouldn't echo through the corridors, maintaining the atmosphere of quiet contemplation. Even the color scheme was carefully considered. The walls were painted in soft, neutral tones. Nothing harsh, nothing that might agitate a prisoner's already fragile mental state. The goal was to create an environment conducive to reflection, not one that would drive men to desperation. Haviland had created a machine, a carefully calibrated instrument designed to transform criminals into penitents. Every element worked together toward this goal: the isolation, the light, the cleanliness, the silence. Even the vaulted ceilings, which made each cell feel like a small chapel, reinforced the message that this was a place of spiritual transformation. The original 7 cell blocks radiated from the central hub with perfect geometric precision. From above, the layout looked like a starfish or a wagon wheel, a design that would be copied in prisons around the world. More than 300 institutions, from Russia to Japan, from England to South America, would adopt variations of Haviland's radial plan, making Eastern State one of the most influential buildings in architectural history. But Haviland's machine had a fatal flaw, one that its designers couldn't have anticipated. It was built on the assumption that human beings, given enough solitude and silence, would naturally turn inward, confront their sins, and emerge spiritually renewed. It assumed that the human mind was like a garden that, properly tended in isolation, would bloom with virtue. The reality, as we'll see, was far different. The human mind isn't a garden. It's more like a social animal, one that withers and sickens when cut off from its kind. And the silence that Haviland designed so carefully into every aspect of Eastern State, that heavy, oppressive silence broken only by the sound of a prisoner's own breathing and the whisper of his own thoughts, that silence didn't lead to enlightenment. It led to madness. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. It's October 1829, and Eastern State Penitentiary is about to receive its first inmate. The machine is built. The experiment is ready to begin. Let's see how the Pennsylvania system worked in practice. The Pennsylvania system, October 25th, 1829, dawned cool and clear in Philadelphia. Inside the newly completed Eastern State Penitentiary, Warden Samuel R. Wood and his staff prepared for a moment that had been years in the making. Today, they would receive their first prisoner, and with him, they would begin testing whether the Pennsylvania system could deliver on its promises of reformation through solitary contemplation. The prisoner's name was Charles Williams, though inside Eastern State, he would be known only by his number. Names were considered unnecessary, even counterproductive. A man's identity in the outside world, with all its social connections and criminal associations, was something he needed to leave behind if he was to be truly reformed. In his cell, he would be just a number, a blank slate upon which penitence could be written. Williams was a young African-American man, 18 years old, sentenced to 2 years of imprisonment for burglary. He had stolen a watch and some other items, nothing particularly violent, but theft nonetheless, and theft was a serious crime. What Williams didn't know, as guards escorted him through the Gothic entrance of Eastern State, was that he was about to become part of an experiment that would shape prison policy for more than a century. The intake procedure was deliberately designed to disorient and intimidate. First, Williams was stripped of his clothing and bathed, a symbolic washing away of his old life. His hair was cut short. He was given a medical examination. Then came the clothing, a simple uniform of coarse fabric that marked him as a prisoner. But the most striking element of his new attire was the hood. This wasn't a simple blindfold. It was a heavy fabric hood that covered his entire head, with no openings except for his mouth, so he could breathe. He couldn't see. He couldn't recognize guards or other prisoners. He couldn't even be recognized by them. The hood served multiple purposes. It prevented him from learning the layout of the prison, which might facilitate an escape attempt. It prevented guards from seeing his face, maintaining his anonymity. And most importantly, it prevented him from seeing other prisoners and being corrupted by their influence before he even reached his cell. Imagine that experience. You're a young man, barely an adult. You've been convicted of a crime and sentenced to 2 years in a place you've only heard stories about. You're led through corridors you can't see, hearing only your own footsteps and the soft padding of guards' feet. The hood makes breathing difficult. You're disoriented, frightened, having no idea what's about to happen to you. Finally, you're brought to a cell. The hood is removed. A guard speaks to you, perhaps the first human voice you've heard since entering this place. He tells you the rules, and the rules are simple but absolute. You will remain in this cell. You will not speak unless spoken to by a guard. You will not attempt to communicate with other prisoners. You will receive 3 meals a day, passed through a slot in your door. You will be given work to do, weaving or shoemaking, skills you can use when you're released. You will exercise in your private yard. You will read your Bible. You will reflect on your crimes and seek God's forgiveness. The guard leaves. The door closes with a heavy thud. And then silence. This was the Pennsylvania system in practice. Charles Williams would spend the next 2 years seeing almost no other human being except the occasional guard or the warden during his required daily visits. He would speak to no one. He would form no friendships, make no alliances, plot no escapes with fellow inmates. He would be alone with his conscience, alone with his Bible, alone with God. During the day, he would work. The prison provided him with materials for shoemaking or weaving. The work served multiple purposes. It kept him occupied, preventing the idleness that authorities believed led to evil thoughts. It taught him a useful trade he could pursue after release. And it helped offset the enormous costs of maintaining separate confinement. The products prisoners made were sold, with the proceeds going to the prison's operating budget. At mealtimes, food would appear through the slot in his door, passed by a silent guard. The meals were actually quite good by prison standards of the era. Bread, meat, soup, vegetables, and plenty of potatoes. The Pennsylvania system wanted prisoners to be well-fed and healthy. A starving, sickly prisoner couldn't contemplate his sins. He'd be too focused on survival. Exercise time came once a day, but even this was conducted in isolation. Williams would be led, sometimes hooded, from his cell to his private exercise yard. He could walk in circles, breathe fresh air, look up at the sky through the high walls that surrounded him. But he couldn't see beyond those walls, couldn't glimpse another prisoner or the outside world. After 30 minutes or an hour, he'd be led back to his cell, and the door would close again. The only book Williams was allowed was a Bible. This was central to the Pennsylvania system's philosophy. The reformers believed that crime was fundamentally a moral failing, a turning away from God's commandments. The path back to righteousness lay in Scripture. So prisoners were given Bibles, and they were expected to read them, to find in those pages the moral guidance they'd lacked in their former lives. For some prisoners, reading the Bible was a genuine comfort. It gave them something to do, a way to pass the endless hours of solitude. The stories, the poetry, the teachings provided a structure for thought, a framework for understanding their situation. For others, particularly those who couldn't read, the Bible was just another source of frustration, a reminder of their inadequacy. The warden was legally required to visit every prisoner every single day. This wasn't a casual check-in. It was a formal interview where the prisoner would be asked about his spiritual state, whether he was reflecting on his crimes, whether he felt genuine remorse. The warden would offer guidance, counsel, sometimes rebuke. These daily visits were meant to substitute for the moral guidance a prisoner might receive from a priest, a parent, or a community elder in the outside world. The overseers, the guards who supervised the cell blocks, were required to look in on each prisoner 3 times daily. Again, this wasn't just about security. It was about moral supervision. They were checking that prisoners were engaging in their work, reading their Bibles, maintaining the contemplative atmosphere that the Pennsylvania system required. Everything about the routine was designed to focus the prisoner's mind inward, towards self-examination and repentance. No distractions, no entertainment, no human connection except with authority figures who were there to guide the prisoner toward moral reformation. The theory was elegant, humane even, at least on paper. Crime was a disease, a moral sickness. The cure was isolation, reflection, and divine grace. But as more prisoners arrived at Eastern State, as the cells began to fill and months turned into years, cracks began to appear in this elegant theory. Because the human mind, it turned out, doesn't respond well to prolonged isolation. Charles Williams completed his sentence and was released in 1831. We don't know what became of him after that. Prison records from that era don't track recidivism reliably. Did he become a productive citizen, reformed by his experience? Or did he return to crime, broken by years of enforced solitude? The historical record is silent. But we do know what happened to many of the prisoners who came after him, and their stories began to reveal the terrible flaw at the heart of the Pennsylvania system. Some prisoners did seem to adapt to the isolation. They threw themselves into their work, read their Bibles voraciously, emerged from their cells at the end of their sentences apparently reformed. These were the success stories the administrators of Eastern State loved to highlight, proof that the system worked, that criminals could be made into penitents through solitary contemplation. But others didn't adapt. They deteriorated. Cut off from all human contact except brief, formal interactions with guards and the warden, they began to talk to themselves. At first, it was just muttering, a way to hear a human voice, even if it was their own. But as months stretched into years, the self-talk became more elaborate, more disturbed. Some prisoners developed elaborate conversations with imaginary companions. Others heard voices that weren't their own, spirits or demons, depending on their religious beliefs, whispering to them through the walls. Visitors to Eastern State, and there were many, the prison became something of a tourist attraction in the 1830s and 1840s, reported hearing inmates sobbing, screaming, laughing hysterically at nothing. Some prisoners would pace endlessly, walking in circles in their cells until they wore grooves in the stone floor. Others would sit motionless for hours, staring at the wall, their minds gone somewhere else entirely. The psychological effects weren't limited to the obviously insane. Many prisoners who seemed to maintain their sanity during their confinement reported, years later, that the experience had damaged them in ways they couldn't fully articulate. They had trouble forming relationships, trusting people, engaging in normal social interactions. The years of isolation had left them unable to function in the world of human connection. The prison authorities recognized this problem, at least to some degree, but they interpreted it differently than we would today. When a prisoner showed signs of mental disturbance, they didn't conclude that the Pennsylvania system was flawed. They concluded that the prisoner was particularly hardened, particularly resistant to moral reformation. The answer, then, wasn't to abandon the system, but to apply it more rigorously, to isolate the prisoner even more completely until his resistance broke. This led to the development of punishments, and this is where the Pennsylvania system revealed its darkest side. Because while the system was supposed to eschew corporal punishment, replacing physical brutality with moral reformation, the reality was quite different. Guards and administrators, frustrated by prisoners who violated the rules by attempting to communicate with each other or who showed signs of rebellion, developed forms of punishment that, while not technically corporal, were arguably worse than a simple beating. But before we descend into that darkness, let's acknowledge what Eastern State did achieve. It did away with the worst excesses of the old prison system. There were no more common rooms where the strong preyed upon the weak, where rape and violence were daily occurrences. Prisoners were housed in clean, relatively comfortable cells with adequate food and basic sanitation. These were genuine improvements, and they saved lives. Moreover, the Pennsylvania system did influence prison design worldwide. More than 300 prisons adopted variations of the radial plan and the principle of separating prisoners from one another. Many of these institutions didn't implement full solitary confinement. They created systems where prisoners worked together but slept separately, or where they were isolated at night but allowed limited contact during the day. But the influence of Eastern State was undeniable. It represented a moment when society took seriously the idea that prisons should reform rather than merely punish. The problem was that the reformers had overreached. They had taken a basically sound principle that prisoners shouldn't be thrown together in violent, corrupt mob and pushed it to an extreme that the human psyche couldn't withstand. Isolation in moderate doses, a few hours or days, can indeed prompt reflection. But isolation measured in months and years doesn't enlighten. It destroys. Prominent visitors began to notice this. In 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French political philosopher, toured Eastern State as part of his study of American democracy. He came away impressed by the cleanliness and order, but troubled by what he'd seen. The prisoners seemed subdued, yes, but not reformed. They seemed broken. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and was even more critical. Dickens was no soft-hearted sentimentalist when it came to crime. His novels portrayed criminals as real threats to social order. But what he saw at Eastern State disturbed him profoundly. He devoted an entire chapter of his travel diary, American Notes, to the prison, and his verdict was damning. "I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain," Dickens wrote, "to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body." He described watching a prisoner who had been in solitary confinement for years, a man who moved and spoke like a ghost, disconnected from reality. Dickens concluded that the Pennsylvania system was cruel and wrong, that it inflicted psychological damage that could never be repaired. But Dickens' criticism, along with that of other observers, took years to have any real impact on prison policy. The administrators of Eastern State were true believers. They had invested not just money, but their reputations and their moral authority in the idea that solitary confinement could transform criminals into penitents. Admitting that the system was fundamentally flawed would mean admitting that they had been torturing men, breaking their minds, in the name of reform. So instead of abandoning the Pennsylvania system, they doubled down on it. They refined it, systematized it, made it more severe. And in doing so, they created a place where silence echoed with suffering, where isolation bred not redemption, but something much darker. Let's journey now into that darkness, into the punishments that awaited prisoners who dared to violate the sacred rule of silence. The dark reality. The Pennsylvania system, for all its high-minded rhetoric about moral reformation and spiritual redemption, rested on a foundation of fear. Fear of breaking the rules, fear of losing even the minimal human contact afforded by a guard's daily visit, fear of punishments that, while not explicitly physical in the traditional sense, were designed to break a prisoner's will and, if necessary, his mind. The fundamental rule at Eastern State was simple. Do not attempt to communicate with other prisoners. This was non-negotiable. The entire philosophy of the Pennsylvania system depended on each inmate being completely isolated from corrupting influences. Any attempt at communication, whether by tapping on walls, speaking through ventilation ducts, or passing notes, was viewed not just as a violation of prison rules, but as a direct assault on the institution's core mission. But here's the thing about human beings. We're social creatures. We're wired at the most fundamental level of our neurology to seek connection with others. Put a person in complete isolation for months or years, and their mind will do almost anything to establish contact, even if it's just the sound of another voice acknowledging their existence. So despite the severe punishments that awaited those who were caught, prisoners constantly tried to communicate with each other. They developed elaborate codes, tapping patterns on water pipes that ran between cells. A certain number of taps meant certain letters, allowing them to spell out messages. They would whisper into heating vents, hoping their voices would carry to nearby cells. They would leave marks on walls during their exercise periods, tiny scratchings that could carry messages to the next prisoner who used that yard. They found ways, creative and desperate ways, to assert their humanity against a system designed to crush it. When prisoners were caught communicating, and they were caught frequently because the guards were vigilant and the prison's design made it difficult to hide such activities for long, they faced punishments that were genuinely horrific. These punishments weren't mentioned in the official literature about Eastern State, the pamphlets and speeches that portrayed it as a humane, enlightened institution. But they were real, and they were applied regularly. Let's start with one of the most notorious, the iron gag. This device was essentially a metal collar that was placed around a prisoner's tongue, clamped tightly, so it couldn't move. Attached to this collar were chains, which were then connected to metal cuffs locked around the prisoner's wrists. The prisoner's hands would be forced high behind his back, creating an agonizingly uncomfortable position. The diabolical genius of the iron gag was that any movement made the punishment worse. If the prisoner tried to lower his arms to relieve the strain on his shoulders, the chains would pull on the collar in his mouth, causing excruciating pain and tearing at his tongue. If he tried to adjust the position of his tongue to ease the pressure, it would pull on his arms, forcing them higher behind his back. There was no comfortable position, no way to reduce the suffering. All the prisoner could do was remain as motionless as possible and endure. The iron gag was typically left on for hours, sometimes days. The toll it took was immense. Prisoners' tongues would be lacerated, bleeding profusely. Some lost consciousness from the pain. And in at least one case, in 1833, a prisoner named Matthias Mackenzie died while in the iron gag. He had been placed in the device at 4 in the afternoon for attempting to communicate with another prisoner. By 5, just 1 hour later, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was listed as apoplexy, essentially a stroke, and prison officials were cleared of any wrongdoing. But everyone understood what had really happened. The iron gag had killed him. The scandal created by Mackenzie's death led to some reforms. The iron gag was officially banned, though there's evidence it continued to be used unofficially for years afterward. But other punishments took its place, equally brutal, if slightly less likely to result in immediate death. There was the water bath, a punishment that sounds almost innocent until you understand what it involved. A prisoner who had violated the rules would be dunked in ice-cold water. This wasn't a quick splash. The prisoner would be submerged, held under until he was thoroughly soaked, his clothes, his hair, every inch of him drenched in freezing water. Then he would be taken outside and chained to an exterior wall of the prison. And then he would be left there all night. This punishment was most commonly used during winter months, when Philadelphia's temperatures routinely dropped below freezing. The wet prisoner, chained to the wall, would begin to shiver uncontrollably as hypothermia set in. His clothes would stiffen as the water in them froze. Ice would literally form on his skin, a thin layer of frost that grew thicker as the night progressed and the temperature dropped. Guards checking on prisoners subjected to the water bath in the morning would find them covered in ice, shaking so violently they could barely stand, sometimes frostbitten, always traumatized. The water bath was borrowed from contemporary mental health treatment, if you can call it treatment. Asylums of the era used cold water immersion as a way to shock patients out of their delusions. The theory, such as it was, held that extreme cold could reset the brain, jolt it back into proper functioning. The reality, of course, was that it just inflicted suffering while providing no therapeutic benefit whatsoever. Applying it to prisoners was simply cruelty disguised as correction. Then there was the mad chair, and the name tells you everything you need to know about its effects. The mad chair was a restraining device, essentially a heavy wooden chair with leather straps attached. A prisoner placed in the mad chair would be strapped down so tightly that he couldn't move at all. Not just couldn't stand up or couldn't walk away, couldn't move. His arms were strapped to the armrests, his legs to the legs of the chair, his torso to the back. The straps were deliberately over-tightened, pulled so hard that they cut into the flesh, restricting blood flow. A prisoner might be left in the mad chair for hours, sometimes for days. They wouldn't be fed. They wouldn't be given water. They would be forced to urinate and defecate where they sat. And all the while, their circulation would be cut off, their limbs swelling, turning first red, then purple, then a sickening blue-black as oxygen deprivation set in. When prisoners were finally released from the mad chair, they often couldn't stand. Their legs were numb, useless. Some required amputations, their limbs so damaged by restricted blood flow that they had begun to necrotize. Others could walk again eventually, but they were left with permanent nerve damage, chronic pain that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The mad chair served no correctional purpose. It didn't reform anyone. It didn't prevent future rule violations. It simply inflicted suffering as a form of retribution, and more insidiously, as a warning to other prisoners. This is what happens if you break the rules. This is what happens if you try to assert your humanity, if you dare to reach out for human connection in defiance of the system. But perhaps the cruelest punishment wasn't a device or a procedure. It was simply more isolation. Beneath cell block 14, prison authorities constructed an underground chamber known variously as the Hole, the Pit, or the Klondike. This was where prisoners who were considered particularly troublesome or dangerous were sent. The Hole consisted of 4 small cells, each about 6 feet by 8 feet, with ceilings so low you couldn't stand fully upright. There were no windows. No light penetrated these cells except for the brief moments when a guard opened the door to push in a food tray or remove waste. There was no plumbing, just a bucket for human waste that would fill with the stench of urine and feces. There was no heating, and in winter the Hole was bitterly cold, while in summer it was stifling, airless, thick with humidity and the smell of human misery. Prisoners sent to the Hole might stay for days, weeks, sometimes months. They would lose all sense of time in the absolute darkness. The only sounds were their own breathing, their own heartbeat, the occasional skittering of rats that infested the underground chamber. They would be fed bread and water, barely enough to sustain life. And they would be left to contemplate their sins in darkness, so complete that they would begin to see things, hallucinations born of sensory deprivation. Men who spent extended periods in the Hole often emerged genuinely insane. They would cower from light, having become so accustomed to darkness that normal daylight caused them physical pain. They would be unable to speak coherently. Their language skills atrophied from weeks or months of having no one to speak to. Some never fully recovered, spending the rest of their sentences in a state of catatonic withdrawal. The existence of these punishments, brutal and dehumanizing as they were, reveals the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of the Pennsylvania system. The reformers who created Eastern State genuinely believed they were building a more humane alternative to the brutality of traditional prisons. They eliminated public whippings, the use of the pillory, the practice of branding criminals. These were the hallmarks of old-world justice, and they had no place in enlightened America. But in their place, they created something arguably worse. Punishments that targeted the mind rather than the body, that broke spirits rather than bones, that drove men mad rather than simply causing them pain. Physical wounds heal. Psychological trauma, especially the kind inflicted by prolonged isolation and systematic dehumanization, can last a lifetime. The guards and administrators who applied these punishments didn't see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as maintaining order, as enforcing the rules that made the Pennsylvania system possible. They believed, many of them sincerely, that they were doing God's work, that the temporary suffering they inflicted served the greater good of moral reformation. This is how evil often works, not through mustache-twirling villains who know they're doing wrong, but through true believers who are convinced that their cruelty serves a higher purpose. The Pennsylvania system created an environment where good people could do terrible things and sleep soundly at night, confident that they were on the side of righteousness. And the prisoners? They had no recourse, no way to appeal their treatment, no voice to speak out against the abuses they suffered. Their families couldn't visit them. Letters were restricted. Even the daily visits from the warden were conducted in an atmosphere where complaining about mistreatment would likely result in more punishment. The prisoners were voiceless, invisible, trapped in a system that proclaimed its humanity while systematically destroying theirs. By the 1850s, even the most ardent supporters of the Pennsylvania system had to acknowledge that something was wrong. Too many prisoners were emerging from Eastern State more damaged than when they entered. Recidivism rates weren't noticeably better than in prisons using the competing Auburn system, where prisoners were allowed to work together in silence during the day. And the costs of maintaining complete separation were becoming unsustainable as Philadelphia's population boomed and crime rates rose. The solution, such as it was, wasn't to abandon the Pennsylvania system entirely. It was to water it down, to compromise its principles in ways that the original reformers would have found horrifying, but that made the system practical to maintain. Let's see how Eastern State evolved as it moved into the latter half of the 19th century. Evolution and overcrowding. The 1850s brought profound changes to Eastern State Penitentiary, changes that were driven not by philosophical evolution, but by cold, hard numbers. Philadelphia's population was exploding. In 1829, when Eastern State opened its doors to Charles Williams, Philadelphia proper had a population of about 80,000. By 1850, that number had grown to over 300,000, and by the 1870s, it would top 500,000. With this population boom came a corresponding increase in crime, or at least in arrests and convictions. The criminal justice system was catching more people in its net, and those people needed somewhere to go. Eastern State had been designed to house 250 prisoners in complete individual isolation. By 1850, it held nearly 500. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Either the Pennsylvania system would have to be abandoned, allowing multiple prisoners to share cells, or Pennsylvania would need to build more prisons implementing the system. The state chose both options, but the construction of new facilities took years, and in the meantime, Eastern State had to adapt or collapse under its own success. The first compromise came with cell sharing. Prisoners were still separated from the general population, but now 2 or 3 men might occupy a cell designed for one. This destroyed the fundamental premise of the Pennsylvania system. How could a man contemplate his sins and achieve genuine penitence when he was sharing 8 by 12 feet with 2 other criminals? The corruption that solitary confinement was meant to prevent was now happening within the cells themselves. But the compromises didn't stop there. As prisoner numbers continued to climb, new cell blocks were constructed to supplement the original 7 that Haviland had designed. These new blocks, built between the existing radial arms, had to be squeezed into awkward spaces. They lacked the architectural grandeur of the originals. More critically, they lacked many of the features that had made the Pennsylvania system theoretically workable. The new cells had no skylights, so the divine light that was supposed to illuminate prisoners' paths to redemption couldn't reach them. They had no individual exercise yards, so prisoners had to be let out in groups to walk in common areas, necessarily bringing them into contact with others. Some of the new cells were built below ground, windowless dungeons that violated every principle of light and air that had guided Haviland's original design. By the 1870s, it was clear that the Pennsylvania system was dead in everything but name. Prisoners were working together in common areas. They were eating together in dining halls constructed in the 1920s. They were talking to each other, forming alliances and friendships, exactly what the system had been designed to prevent. The hooding of prisoners as they moved through the facility was abandoned, initially as an efficiency measure, but with the practical effect that prisoners could see and recognize each other. The guards stopped wearing soft-soled shoes. The silence that had been so carefully cultivated gave way to the normal sounds of a large institution. Voices, footsteps, doors slamming, the clatter of tools and dishes. Eastern State was no longer a cathedral of penitence. It was becoming a regular prison, albeit one with unusual architecture. The official abandonment of the Pennsylvania system came in 1913, though in practice it had been dying for decades. The announcement was almost anticlimactic. Eastern State would no longer attempt to enforce complete isolation of prisoners. Instead, it would operate as what was called a congregate prison, where inmates lived in separate cells but worked, ate, and recreated together. This brought Eastern State in line with the Auburn system, the competing model developed at New York's Auburn Prison in the 1820s. The Auburn system also separated prisoners at night, housing them in individual cells, but allowed them to work together in silence during the day. It was more economical than the Pennsylvania system, requiring less space and fewer guards per prisoner. And it avoided the worst psychological effects of complete isolation while still preventing the chaos of communal incarceration. But abandoning the Pennsylvania system didn't solve Eastern State's problems. The prison was still overcrowded, still operating well beyond its intended capacity. By the 1920s, it held over 1,700 prisoners in a facility designed for 250. Every cell housed multiple inmates. Temporary structures were erected in the courtyards to provide additional sleeping space. The infrastructure, designed for a much smaller population, struggled to keep up. Plumbing backed up. Heating systems failed. The elegant machine that Haviland had designed was breaking down. The nature of the prisoner population was changing too. Eastern State had originally housed criminals convicted of all sorts of offenses, from petty theft to murder. But as Pennsylvania built more prisons, Eastern State increasingly became a facility for serious offenders, violent criminals who were considered too dangerous for other institutions. This changed the atmosphere dramatically. The contemplative quiet of the original Pennsylvania system, already long abandoned, was replaced by the tension and violence that characterizes any prison housing dangerous men in close proximity. Gang affiliations, which the Pennsylvania system had been designed to prevent, flourished. Prisoners formed protective groups based on ethnicity, criminal specialty, or geographic origin. These groups controlled contraband trade, settled disputes violently, and created a shadow hierarchy that existed alongside and often superseded the official prison administration. The guards, overwhelmed and underpaid, increasingly relied on prisoner cooperation to maintain order. Informal arrangements were made. Certain prisoners, usually gang leaders, were given privileges in exchange for keeping their followers in line. This was the exact corruption that the Pennsylvania system's founders had warned against, the melding of criminal and official authority that made rehabilitation impossible. Despite these problems, Eastern State continued to function. It had to. Pennsylvania's prison system was perpetually overcrowded, and closing Eastern State would simply transfer its prisoners to other already overcrowded facilities. So it limped along, a once revolutionary institution that had become just another aging, overcrowded prison struggling to manage a population it wasn't designed to hold. Some improvements were made. In 1924, a synagogue was built inside the prison, the first in any American correctional facility. This reflected both the growing Jewish population among prisoners and a recognition that religious practice, even in a congregate environment, might serve some of the reformative purposes that isolation had failed to achieve. The synagogue was named for Alfred Fleischer, the chairman of the board of trustees who had championed its construction and who died suddenly in 1928, shortly after its completion. Athletic programs were introduced. Prisoners played baseball in the yard, organized into teams that competed against each other. This was a far cry from the solitary exercise periods of the Pennsylvania system, but it provided a constructive outlet for energy and aggression. The baseball field became one of Eastern State's more distinctive features, visible from the surrounding neighborhood, a reminder that whatever else it was, this was also a place where men lived out their lives. Medical facilities were expanded. A full hospital wing was constructed, equipped with operating rooms, X-ray equipment, a pharmacy, and even a solarium where tuberculosis patients could receive sunlight therapy. The quality of medical care at Eastern State, while not up to modern standards, was actually quite good for a prison of the era. Inmates with serious illnesses were treated aggressively, and mortality rates from disease were lower than in many other prisons. But these improvements couldn't mask the fundamental problems. Eastern State was old, expensive to maintain, and located in the middle of a growing residential neighborhood. The Fairmount area, which had been open farmland when the prison was built, was now densely developed with row houses and apartment buildings. Residents complained about the prison's presence, worried about escaped convicts, and the general aura of criminality that it brought to their neighborhood. Escapes, while never common at Eastern State, did occur with regularity that alarmed both prison authorities and the public. The prison's medieval walls, designed more for psychological impact than actual security, could be scaled with a well-constructed ladder. Guards posted in the towers had limited visibility and could be eluded by clever inmates who timed their attempts carefully. In July 1923, 6 inmates, led by a man named Leo Callahan, executed a daring escape that captivated the public's imagination. They had built a ladder from scavenged materials, assembled it under cover of darkness, and used it to scale the 30-foot-high eastern wall. 5 of the escapees were eventually recaptured, some after fleeing as far as Hawaii. But Leo Callahan was never found. To this day, he remains the only inmate to successfully escape from Eastern State and remain at large. More infamous was the escape of April 3rd, 1945, which we'll explore in detail later. But for now, understand that these escapes, while dramatic, were symptoms of deeper problems. A properly functioning prison doesn't experience frequent escape attempts. Such attempts indicate either inadequate security or prisoner desperation, or both. At Eastern State, it was mostly the former. The prison's security systems, designed in the 1820s, were simply inadequate for the 1920s and beyond. Riots became increasingly common. In 1933, prisoners set fire to their cells in protest of overcrowding and poor recreational facilities. The riot was suppressed, but it sent a clear message. Eastern State was a tinderbox, always one spark away from explosion. Another major riot in 1961, the largest in the prison's history, reinforced this message. Prisoners took control of multiple cell blocks, holding them for hours before authorities regained control. After the 1961 riot, serious discussions began about closing Eastern State Penitentiary. It was expensive to operate, difficult to secure, and located in the middle of an urban area where land values were rising. The state had built newer, more modern prisons in rural areas where land was cheap and neighbors were few. Greater Ford, about 30 miles northwest of Philadelphia, had opened in 1929 as what was sometimes called Eastern State's Farm Branch. It could house thousands of prisoners in modern facilities, and it made Eastern State's continued operation seem less essential. But closing a prison isn't simple. It requires planning, coordination, and most of all, somewhere to send the prisoners. So Eastern State continued to operate throughout the 1960s, increasingly decrepit, increasingly troubled, its massive stone walls standing as a monument to ideas that had long since been abandoned. The end, when it finally came, was quiet and bureaucratic. In 1970, faced with mounting repair costs and deteriorating conditions, Pennsylvania ceased operations at Eastern State Penitentiary. The last prisoners were transferred out, most going to Greater Ford. The guards and staff were reassigned. And on a day in January 1971, after 142 years of continuous operation, Eastern State Penitentiary closed its doors. The building sat empty. Briefly, it was used to house city inmates following a riot at another Philadelphia jail, but this was a stopgap measure that lasted only months. Then came true abandonment. The city owned the building, but had no plans for it. Proposals floated for redevelopment, shopping mall, luxury apartments, but nothing materialized. And so Eastern State simply sat, locked and empty, its medieval walls enclosing a space where time had stopped. Nature began to reclaim the prison. Trees sprouted in the exercise yards, growing tall and thick. Vines crept up walls and through broken windows. The root systems broke through concrete and worked their way into the foundations. Rain leaked through deteriorating roofs, causing plaster to fall and creating massive puddles on floors. It became an urban forest, a strange wilderness in the middle of Philadelphia. Stray cats took up residence, dozens then hundreds of them, creating a thriving feline community in the empty cell blocks. They were the only residents now, and they turned Eastern State into something of a cat sanctuary, though an unofficial and haphazard one. Local animal lovers would leave food at the walls, and the cats multiplied, generation after generation, living out their lives in cells that had once held some of Philadelphia's most dangerous criminals. The neighborhood around Eastern State watched this decay with mixed feelings. Some residents were glad the prison was closed, happy to see the end of an institution that had cast such a long shadow over their community. Others worried about the vacant building, fearing it would attract vandals, squatters, or drug users. And a few, those with a sense of history and preservation, worried that an irreplaceable piece of architectural heritage was being lost to neglect and time. In the early 1980s, the city decided to sell the property. Developers salivated at the prospect. 10 acres in a densely developed area of Philadelphia, with good transportation access and an interesting existing structure that could be partially incorporated into new construction. It was a real estate goldmine. Proposals poured in, most envisioning commercial development that would completely obliterate the historic prison. But then something unexpected happened. A coalition of preservationists, historians, architects, and neighborhood activists came together to save Eastern State Penitentiary. They argued that this wasn't just an old prison. It was a national historic landmark, designated as such in 1965, one of the most important examples of 19th century architecture in America, and a structure that had influenced prison design worldwide. Demolishing it would be an act of cultural vandalism. This coalition, which became known as the Eastern State Penitentiary Task Force, lobbied the city, the state, and anyone else who would listen. They held public meetings. They contacted preservation organizations nationally. They generated media attention, turning Eastern State's potential demolition into a cause célèbre among historic preservationists. Their efforts culminated in 1988 when Philadelphia Mayor Wilson Goode, responding to public pressure, halted the sale of Eastern State for redevelopment. Instead, the task force would be given time and resources to develop a plan for preserving the site and opening it to the public as a historic attraction. This decision saved Eastern State Penitentiary from destruction, but it also raised enormous questions. What do you do with a decaying prison? How do you preserve a structure that's falling apart? How do you interpret a history that's equal parts innovation and cruelty? And perhaps most pressingly, how do you pay for all of this? The answers to these questions would take years to develop. But in 1988, as the task force took possession of the abandoned prison and began planning its future, one thing was clear. Eastern State Penitentiary would live again, though in a form its founders could never have imagined. Before we explore that transformation, though, we need to talk about the inmates who made Eastern State famous, the criminals whose presence gave the prison a notoriety that transcended its architectural significance. Let's meet some of the most infamous residents of America's first penitentiary. Famous inmates. Eastern State Penitentiary, over its 142 years of operation, housed approximately 75,000 inmates. Most of them are forgotten now, their names lost to history, their crimes no more than entries in dusty record books. But a few achieved a fame, or perhaps infamy, that has lasted long after their release or death. These inmates, through the drama of their crimes, the audacity of their escapes, or simply the force of their personalities, became part of Eastern State's legend. Let's meet the most notorious among them. Al Capone, gangster in a gilded cage. On May 17, 1929, Alphonse Gabriel Capone, better known as Al Capone or Scarface, was arrested outside a movie theater in Philadelphia. He was 30 years old and at the height of his power as the most feared gangster in America. From his base in Chicago, Capone controlled a criminal empire that earned him an estimated $100 million per year, roughly $1. $5 billion in today's money, through bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and various other illegal enterprises. Capone's arrest was almost accidental. He was traveling from Atlantic City back to Chicago when Philadelphia police, who had been tipped off about his presence in the city, picked him up on a weapons charge. He was carrying a concealed .38 caliber revolver without a permit, a relatively minor offense that normally would have resulted in a fine or a few days in jail. But the Philadelphia courts, knowing exactly who they had in custody, threw the book at him. Capone was sentenced to 1 year in prison, the maximum penalty for a concealed weapons charge. He was sent to Eastern State Penitentiary, and his arrival generated enormous media attention. Here was America's most notorious criminal, the man suspected of ordering the St. Valentine's Day massacre just 3 months earlier, being locked up in America's most famous prison. Reporters mobbed the entrance. Photographers jockeyed for position. The public was fascinated. What happened next became one of the enduring mysteries of Capone's incarceration. According to some accounts, particularly a story published in the Philadelphia Public Ledger, Capone's cell was lavishly furnished. The newspaper described Oriental rugs on the floor, fine paintings on the walls, a cabinet radio, comfortable furniture. The article portrayed Capone living in luxury, using his wealth and influence to buy comforts that other prisoners could only dream of. This story has been repeated countless times, cementing itself in popular culture as the definitive account of Capone's time at Eastern State. Tours of the prison today feature a recreated Al Capone cell based on these descriptions, complete with plush furnishings and period decorations. But here's where it gets complicated. The Philadelphia Public Ledger story appeared on the day after Capone's arrival at Eastern State. The very next day, a rival newspaper, the Philadelphia Record, published its own account of Capone's cell, and this description was radically different. According to the Record, Capone's cell was Spartan, no different from any other prisoner's accommodations. The furniture was standard prison issue. There were no rugs, no radio, no paintings. Just a bunk, a small table, and the usual plumbing fixtures. So which account was accurate? It's difficult to say with certainty nearly a century later. What we do know is that the prison officials and guards at Eastern State were susceptible to corruption, and Capone had essentially unlimited resources to bribe them. It's entirely plausible that he did receive special treatment, at least initially. But we also know that the Public Ledger story generated a scandal. Public outrage at the idea that a notorious criminal was living in luxury while law-abiding citizens struggled through the Depression put pressure on prison officials to ensure Capone didn't receive preferential treatment. So even if his cell was initially luxurious, those accommodations probably didn't last long. What's not in dispute is that Capone's time at Eastern State was psychologically troubled. According to other prisoners and guards, Capone was often heard at night crying out, begging someone named Jimmy to leave him alone. The common interpretation is that Capone was being haunted by the ghost of James Clark, one of the 7 men killed in the St. Valentine's Day massacre that Capone had allegedly ordered. Whether you believe in literal ghosts or interpret this as Capone's guilty conscience manifesting in nightmares, it's clear that his incarceration deeply affected him. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, surrounded by bodyguards and yes-men, rarely hearing the word no. Now he was locked in his cell, powerless, facing the consequences of his actions in a way he never had before. Capone served 8 months of his 1-year sentence, released early for good behavior. His release date was carefully planned, March 17, 1930, St. Patrick's Day, a date that holds particular significance given Capone's Irish wife and his longtime association with Irish street gangs during his rise to power in Chicago. The release was conducted in secret to avoid the media circus that had accompanied his arrival. Prison officials transferred Capone to another facility, Greater Furt, and released him from there, allowing him to avoid the crowd of reporters and photographers that had gathered at Eastern State's entrance. By the time the media realized what had happened, Capone was already on a train back to Chicago. Today, visitors to Eastern State can tour a recreation of what Al Capone's cell might have looked like, though with the caveat that we can't be certain of the historical accuracy. What we can say is that Capone's brief incarceration there added to the prison's mystique and gave it a connection to one of the most famous criminals in American history. Willie Sutton, the gentleman bandit. If Al Capone brought Eastern State national attention, Willie Sutton brought it immortality through one of the most legendary escape attempts in prison history. But before we get to the escape, let's understand who Willie Sutton was. Born William Francis Sutton Jr. in Brooklyn, New York in 1901, Sutton began his criminal career young. By age 9, he had committed his first burglary. But unlike many criminals who start young and remain small time, Sutton possessed a particular genius for bank robbery. Over a career spanning 4 decades, he would rob an estimated 100 banks, stealing approximately $2 million, which would be close to $30 million today. What made Sutton famous wasn't just the scope of his crimes, but his method. He was a master of disguise, often dressing as a police officer, mailman, or even a guard to gain entry to banks. He was unfailingly polite to the bank employees he robbed, never harming anyone, which earned him nicknames like the Gentleman Bandit and Willie the Actor. His style and charm made him something of a folk hero during the Depression, when many Americans had little love for banks that were foreclosing on homes and farms. But Sutton was also remarkably unlucky when it came to evading capture. Despite his skills, he was arrested and imprisoned multiple times. In 1934, after the machine gun robbery of the Corn Exchange Bank in Philadelphia, Sutton was caught, tried, and sentenced to 25 to 50 years at Eastern State Penitentiary. For Sutton, this sentence was especially galling. He had successfully escaped from 3 previous prisons, earning a reputation as one of America's premier escape artists. But Eastern State, with its massive walls and radial design, was supposed to be escape-proof. Sutton saw this as a challenge. What happened next took over a year of meticulous planning and backbreaking labor. Sutton and 11 other prisoners, led by a cellmate named Clarence Kleiny Kleindienst, began digging a tunnel. This wasn't the Hollywood version of a prison escape, where a lone hero chips away at his wall with a spoon. This was a carefully coordinated engineering project involving a dozen men working in shifts. The tunnel started in cell 68 in cell block 7. The prisoners, using improvised tools made from spoons, tin cans beaten flat to serve as shovels, and other scavenged materials, first had to break through the wall of the cell itself. This wall was thick stone, and breaking through it without alerting guards required absolute silence and patience. They worked at night when the prison was quietest, stuffing cloth around their tools to muffle any sound. Once through the wall, they encountered their next challenge. They were still inside the prison. The walls of Eastern State extended 30 feet above ground, but crucially, they also extended 25 feet below ground, designed specifically to prevent tunneling escapes. So the prisoners couldn't simply dig horizontally under the wall. They had to go down first, burrowing straight down through rock and soil until they were deep enough to safely pass under the wall's foundation. This descent took months. The prisoners removed tons of earth and rock, 1 bucket at a time, disposing of it by spreading it in their exercise yards and mixing it with dirt that was already there. They reinforced the tunnel's walls with boards stolen from around the prison, creating a structure that would support the weight of the earth above without collapsing and burying them alive. Once they reached sufficient depth, about 12 to 15 feet below the surface, they began digging horizontally toward the perimeter. This horizontal section stretched about 100 feet, a cramped, dark passage where a man had to crawl on his belly, pushing a bucket of dirt ahead of him while another man behind him pulled on a rope attached to the bucket to help move it along. The conditions in the tunnel were hellish. The air was stale and thin, barely sufficient to breathe. The men worked by the light of homemade lamps fueled by grease saved from their meals. They were constantly filthy, covered in mud and their own sweat. And they lived with the ever-present fear that the tunnel would collapse, that they would suffocate in the darkness. Their bodies never recovered. Finally, on April 3rd, 1945, after more than a year of work, the tunnel was complete. The prisoners who had built it, 12 men, including Sutton and Kleindienst, prepared for their escape. They had timed it for early evening, a period when guard changes were occurring and attention might be less focused than at other times. Kleindienst and his cellmate, William Russell, went first, breaking through the last few feet of earth and emerging on the sidewalk of Fairmount Avenue, outside the prison walls. One by one, the other escapees followed, crawling through the narrow tunnel and emerging into freedom. But there was a problem, actually several problems. First, the tunnel exit was located just a few feet from the prison wall, not the greater distance the prisoners had calculated. They emerged onto the sidewalk dirty, disheveled, obviously fresh from some underground ordeal. Second, it was still daylight, and there were people on the street. Witnesses immediately saw the prisoners emerging from the ground and recognized something strange was happening. Third, and most critically, the prisoners were wet and muddy, and they left obvious tracks on the sidewalk. The tunnel had encountered groundwater in its final section, soaking everyone who crawled through it. Now they were leaving muddy footprints that pointed like arrows back to the tunnel entrance. Willie Sutton, despite being one of the architects of the escape, was the first to be captured. He made it only 2 blocks before a police officer, alerted by the commotion, spotted him and gave chase. Sutton, exhausted from the ordeal in the tunnel and knowing the footprints made his capture inevitable, surrendered without a fight. He was back in custody within minutes of emerging from the tunnel. The other escapees didn't fare much better. Clarence Kleindienst, the engineering genius who had designed and led the tunnel construction, was captured about 2 hours later. He had made it farther than Sutton, but not far enough. Additional escapees were caught over the following days and weeks. Some had fled to other states, but they were tracked down through a combination of witness statements and their own inability to stay hidden while broke and on the run. All 12 of the escapees were eventually recaptured, though some took longer than others. The last to be found had made it several hundred miles from Philadelphia, but he too was brought back. Each received additional time added to his sentence, typically 3 to 6 years, as punishment for the escape attempt. The tunnel itself became legendary. Prison officials filled it with ash from the prison's incinerator and covered it with cement, erasing the physical evidence of the escape but not its memory. For decades, the exact location of the tunnel was lost, becoming almost mythical, a story that everyone knew but that had no physical proof. Then, in 2005, on the 60th anniversary of the escape, a team of archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar and historical research techniques worked to locate the tunnel. They found it, right where the historical accounts said it should be, and conducted a limited excavation to document its structure. Today, a painted line on the ground at Eastern State traces the path the tunnel took from cell 68 under the wall to the Fairmount Avenue sidewalk. Willie Sutton would go on to escape from another prison, Holmesburg in Philadelphia, in 1950, remaining at large for 6 years before being recognized from a wanted poster and captured. He eventually served over 30 years in various prisons before being released on compassionate grounds in 1969 due to failing health. He died in 1980 at age 79. His legacy secure as one of the most successful bank robbers and most accomplished escape artists in American criminal history. His time at Eastern State, particularly the legendary tunnel escape, cemented the prison's reputation as a place where extraordinary things happened, where desperate men attempted impossible feats, and where, sometimes, they almost succeeded. Leo Callahan, the one who got away. Of the more than 100 escape attempts from Eastern State Penitentiary over its 142-year history, only one was completely successful. On July 10th, 1923, Leo Callahan and 5 accomplices executed a daring daylight escape that shocked both the prison administration and the public. Callahan was serving time for assault and battery with intent to kill, a violent crime that had landed him in one of America's most secure facilities. But Callahan, like many prisoners at Eastern State, spent his time planning not reformation but liberation. The escape plan was audacious in its simplicity. Callahan and his accomplices, working in the prison's carpentry shop where they had access to tools and materials, built a wooden ladder. This wasn't a crude improvisation. It was a carefully constructed device, tall enough to reach the top of Eastern State's 30-foot perimeter wall and strong enough to support the weight of multiple men climbing it simultaneously. Smuggling the ladder from the workshop to the exercise yard, where the escape would take place, required careful coordination and the complicity, or at least the inattention, of multiple guards. But somehow they managed it. On the morning of July 10th, during exercise period when prisoners were gathered in the yard, Callahan and his 5 companions produced their ladder, propped it against the eastern wall, and began climbing. The escape occurred in broad daylight with dozens of other prisoners watching. Some accounts suggest the escaping prisoners held guards at gunpoint, though where they obtained firearms is unclear from the historical record. Other accounts suggest the guards were simply overwhelmed, unable to respond quickly enough to prevent the escape. One by one, the 6 men climbed the ladder, dropped down the other side of the wall into the street, and fled in different directions. Within minutes, alarms were sounding throughout the prison and across Philadelphia. Police were mobilized. Roadblocks were set up. The hunt was on. Over the following weeks and months, 5 of the 6 escapees were recaptured. One was caught in Philadelphia itself, another in New York, a third made it as far as Honolulu before being recognized and arrested. Their freedom, so desperately sought and so daringly achieved, lasted only days or weeks. But Leo Callahan was different. Callahan vanished completely. Despite a nationwide manhunt, despite rewards offered for information leading to his capture, despite the FBI eventually joining the search, Callahan was never found. He simply disappeared into the vastness of America, presumably adopting a new identity, living out his life as a free man, while officially he remained an escaped convict. To this day, Leo Callahan is the only prisoner to successfully escape from Eastern State Penitentiary and remain at large. His fate is unknown. He may have lived to old age, dying in his bed decades after his escape. He may have been killed shortly after the escape, his body never identified. He may have fled to another country, building a new life far from the reach of American law enforcement. Whatever happened to him, Leo Callahan achieved something that Willie Sutton, with all his genius for escape, never managed. He got away, and in doing so, he added another layer to the mystique of Eastern State Penitentiary, proving that even America's most secure prison, even a facility designed specifically to prevent escapes, could be beaten. Pep the dog, the most unusual inmate. Not all of Eastern State's famous inmates were human. In 1924, a Labrador retriever named Pep arrived at the prison under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. The official story, as told by Pennsylvania Governor Gifford Pinchot, was that Pep had killed his wife's cherished cat and was being sent to Eastern State as punishment. Prison records seem to support this narrative. Pep was given inmate number C-2559 and had a mug shot taken, the famous photograph showing a somewhat guilty-looking dog staring into the camera. But there's another version of events, one supported by a contemporary newspaper article and by the practical considerations of what actually happened. According to this account, Governor Pinchot donated his dog to Eastern State Penitentiary to serve as a mascot and morale booster for both inmates and staff. The life sentence was a joke, a bit of whimsy that the press latched onto and turned into a sensational story about a killer dog serving time for murder. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in between. Pep was indeed sent to Eastern State by the governor. Whether this was punishment for killing a cat or a charitable donation is unclear. But what is certain is that Pep became beloved by inmates and staff alike. The dog had free run of the prison, wandering through cell blocks, participating in exercise periods, sleeping wherever he chose. Prisoners who were denied almost all other forms of companionship could interact with Pep, petting him, playing with him, finding in this simple animal a connection to normalcy and kindness that the prison otherwise lacked. Pep lived at Eastern State for several years before dying in 1930. He was buried on prison grounds, mourned by inmates and guard alike. His story, part legend and part truth, adds a touch of whimsy to the otherwise grim history of Eastern State Penitentiary. These famous inmates, from the powerful gangster to the clever thief to the successful escapee to the loyal dog, became part of Eastern State's identity. They humanized a structure that might otherwise be remembered only as an architectural curiosity or a historical footnote. Through their stories, we can connect with the reality of what Eastern State was. Not just a building, but a place where real people, for better or worse, lived out chapters of their lives. But as the 20th century progressed, as Eastern State became increasingly overcrowded and outdated, it became clear that the prison's days were numbered. The question wasn't whether it would close, but when, and what would happen to this massive, historically significant structure once its doors finally shut for the last time. Riots, decline, and closure. The 1930s and 40s were turbulent decades for Eastern State Penitentiary, mirroring the turbulence of the era. The Great Depression had put enormous strain on Pennsylvania's budget, and prisons, always low on the priority list, saw their funding cut. Maintenance was deferred. Staff positions went unfilled. The infrastructure, already struggling under overcrowding, deteriorated further. This neglect had consequences. In April 1933, frustrated by poor conditions, insufficient recreational facilities, and the grinding monotony of prison life, a group of inmates rioted. They set fire to their cells, smashed what furniture they had, and refused to comply with guards' orders. The riot was eventually suppressed through a combination of force and negotiation, but it sent a clear message. Eastern State was a powder keg. Just a year later, in 1934, another riot broke out, this one even more serious. Prisoners took control of entire cell blocks, barricaded themselves inside, and demanded better treatment. It took hours for authorities to regain control, and in the aftermath, The prison administration had to acknowledge that fundamental changes were needed. But changes cost money, and money was in short supply. So instead of addressing the root causes of the riots, overcrowding and deteriorating conditions, prison officials focused on suppression. Security was tightened. Privileges were reduced. The answer to unrest was more control, more restriction, more punishment. This approach created a vicious cycle. Tighter control bred more resentment, which led to more unrest, which justified even tighter control. Eastern State, which had begun with such high ideals about moral reformation, had devolved into a place where the primary goal was simply maintaining order from one day to the next. The surrounding neighborhood added another layer of complexity. When Eastern State was built in the 1820s, it sat on the outskirts of Philadelphia, surrounded by farmland. By the 1930s, the city had grown around it. Fairmount was now a densely populated working-class neighborhood, home to workers from nearby factories like Baldwin Locomotive Works and from the numerous breweries that dotted the area. These neighbors had mixed feelings about the prison. On one hand, it provided jobs for guards and staff, and it represented a certain stability, a landmark that had been part of the neighborhood for generations. On the other hand, it was a constant source of anxiety. Every escape attempt, every riot, every report of violence within the walls reminded residents that dangerous criminals lived just a few blocks from their homes. As the decades passed, this anxiety only grew. The prison was aging. Security measures that might have been adequate in the 1920s were woefully insufficient by the 1960s. Modern prisons were being built in rural areas, far from population centers, with state-of-the-art security systems. Eastern State, sitting in the middle of urban Philadelphia with 19th-century walls and locks, seemed increasingly anachronistic. The riot of 1961 was the last straw. It was the largest and most violent in Eastern State's history. Prisoners took hostages, caused extensive property damage, and held sections of the prison for hours. When order was finally restored, both state officials and local residents agreed. Something had to change. The Pennsylvania state government began serious discussions about closing Eastern State. But closing a major prison is a complex undertaking. You can't simply unlock the doors and send everyone home. The prisoners need to be transferred to other facilities, and those facilities need to have space available. Staff need to be reassigned or laid off. The physical plant needs to be dealt with, either demolished, sold, or repurposed. These logistics took time to work out. Throughout the 1960s, as the closure was debated and planned, Eastern State continued to operate, though everyone knew its days were numbered. New prisons, built in less populated areas with modern security features, began accepting transfers from Eastern State, slowly reducing its population. Meanwhile, the facility continued to deteriorate. The magnificent skylight-illuminated cell blocks leaked when it rained. Plumbing backed up regularly. Heating systems worked intermittently, if at all. Parts of the structure were literally crumbling, stone and mortar weakened by decades of exposure to the elements and lack of proper maintenance. By the late 1960s, portions of Eastern State had become genuinely dangerous to occupy. Some cell blocks were condemned and emptied, their prisoners relocated to safer areas of the facility. The condemned sections were simply closed off, left to decay, while the rest of the prison continued operating. Finally, in 1970, Pennsylvania announced that Eastern State Penitentiary would close. Over the next year, the remaining prisoners were transferred, mostly to Greater Ford. Staff were reassigned or retired. Files and records were packed up and moved to state archives. And on January 5th, 1971, Eastern State Penitentiary officially ceased operations as a correctional facility. For a brief period in 1971, the prison was used to house city inmates following a riot at Holmesburg Prison, another Philadelphia jail. But this was a temporary expedient, and after a few months, those prisoners too were transferred elsewhere. Eastern State stood empty. The immediate aftermath of closure was chaotic. The city of Philadelphia, which had purchased the property from the state, had no clear plan for what to do with it. The Philadelphia Streets Department briefly used some of the buildings for storage, parking trucks in exercise yards, and filling cells with equipment. But there was no maintenance, no security, no effort to preserve what was, after all, a national historic landmark. Nature, as it tends to do, began reclaiming the space. The exercise yards, no longer trampled by inmates' feet, sprouted grass, then weeds, then bushes and small trees. Seeds blown by the wind found purchase in cracks in the pavement and germinated, their roots working deeper into the structure, widening cracks, breaking apart masonry. Rain leaked through the deteriorating roofs, forming puddles on floors that froze in winter and created conditions perfect for mold growth in summer. Plaster, loosened by moisture, fell from ceilings and walls, littering the floors with debris. Windows, broken by vandals or simply by the wind, allowed birds and small animals to enter, and they made nests in the rafters and cell blocks. Most notably, the prison became home to hundreds of stray cats. They moved in through broken windows and gaps in the walls, finding in the abandoned structure a perfect habitat. Shelter from the elements, protection from larger predators, and a steady supply of rodents to hunt. The cats multiplied, generation after generation born and raised within the walls, creating a feral colony that numbered in the hundreds by the 1980s. The decaying prison became a haunt for urban explorers, despite being officially off-limits and dangerous. The city occasionally hired security guards to patrol the perimeter, but it was impossible to keep determined trespassers out. The massive wall had numerous weak points, places where determined individuals could climb over or where sections had crumbled enough to create passages. Inside, explorers found a haunting landscape. Empty cells with their doors hanging open, corridors filled with debris, vegetation growing in places that had once been pristine and carefully maintained. The juxtaposition of architectural grandeur and decay created an atmosphere that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Photographers were particularly drawn to Eastern State during this period. The play of light through broken skylights, illuminating dust motes and vegetation, created striking images. The decay itself, rust and rot and crumbling stone, had an aesthetic quality that spoke to themes of time's passage and civilization's impermanence. Eastern State became something of a secret among those who appreciated abandoned places, a cathedral of decay in the midst of urban Philadelphia. But this romantic vision of ruins ignored a more pressing question. What was going to happen to this structure? The city owned it, but didn't want the responsibility or expense of maintaining it. Developers eyed the prime real estate hungrily, proposing projects that would demolish most or all of the prison to make way for shopping centers, office buildings, or luxury apartments. In the early 1980s, the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority began seriously entertaining proposals for commercial redevelopment. 3 developers submitted plans, each envisioning tearing down significant portions of the historic structure. For preservationists, this was a nightmare scenario. One of the most architecturally significant buildings in America was about to be destroyed for a shopping mall. This is where our story shifts from tragedy to something more hopeful. A small group of preservationists, historians, and concerned citizens, horrified by the prospect of losing Eastern State, began organizing to save it. This grassroots movement would eventually grow into the Eastern State Penitentiary Task Force, and their efforts would ensure that this remarkable building would survive, not as a prison, not as a shopping mall, but as something entirely new. A stabilized ruin, a museum, and a place for contemplating the complex legacy of American criminal justice. But before we explore that transformation, we need to address something that's been whispered about Eastern State since it closed, something that draws thousands of visitors each year who aren't interested in architecture or prison history, but in something else entirely: the ghosts. Because if any place on earth should be haunted, it's a prison where thousands suffered, many died, and isolation drove men mad. Let's explore the paranormal reputation of Eastern State Penitentiary. The paranormal presence. The first reports of unusual phenomena at Eastern State Penitentiary didn't wait for the prison to close. They began in the 1940s, when both guards and inmates reported experiences they couldn't explain. Voices heard when no one was speaking, shadows moving in empty corridors, the feeling of being watched when alone. These early reports were rarely taken seriously. Prisons are stressful environments where minds can play tricks, where isolation and fear can create hallucinations. The guard attributed the inmates' stories to the psychological effects of confinement. The inmates attributed the guards' stories to guilt over the harsh conditions they enforced. Everyone found a rational explanation that allowed them to dismiss the irrational. But the reports persisted, and they followed certain patterns. Specific locations within the prison were repeatedly identified as centers of unusual activity. Cell Block 12 became notorious for voices, loud enough to echo through the stone corridors, sometimes screaming, sometimes laughing, sometimes engaging in conversations that no living person was having. Guards walking through Cell Block 12 at night, when all prisoners should have been asleep, would hear these voices clearly, but when they investigated, they'd find all the cells silent, their occupants either asleep or equally disturbed by sounds they couldn't identify. Cell Block 6 was known for shadow figures, dark forms that would move along the walls or dart between cells. These shadows didn't behave like normal shadows cast by people walking with lanterns or flashlights. They moved independently against the light source or in directions that no physical person could move. Guards reported watching these shadows and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, a primal fear that had no obvious source, but that made them reluctant to patrol that cell block alone. Cell Block 4 was perhaps the most unsettling. Guards and, later, visitors would report seeing faces, tortured expressions appearing on the walls or in the very air itself. These weren't tricks of light and shadow, carved stone, or artifacts of vision. They were distinct, anguished faces that would appear for moments before fading away, leaving observers shaken and doubting their own sanity. The experiences weren't limited to the cell blocks. The guard towers, perched at intervals along the perimeter wall, had their own reputation. A solitary figure, dressed in what appeared to be an old guard's uniform, was repeatedly seen standing in one of the towers, visible from the street outside the prison. This figure would stand motionless, as if keeping watch, then simply vanish when observers looked away for a moment. After Eastern State closed in 1971, the paranormal reports intensified. This makes sense from a psychological standpoint. An active prison is a noisy, bustling place. There are always explanations for sounds and movements. Other prisoners, guards going about their duties, maintenance activities. But an abandoned prison is silent. Any sound, any movement stands out starkly, demanding attention and explanation. The people who experienced these phenomena during Eastern State's abandoned years were urban explorers, security guards, and eventually preservation workers. Many had no particular belief in the paranormal. They were pragmatic individuals going about their business, and what they encountered shook their skepticism. One of the most famous accounts comes from Gary Johnson, a locksmith working on restoration in the early 1990s. Johnson was experienced with old buildings and old locks. He'd worked on numerous historic structures and considered himself level-headed and practical. But what happened to him in cell block 4 defied any practical explanation. Johnson was working on repairing a lock on one of the cell doors, a routine task he'd performed dozens of times already in different parts of the prison. He had the old lock removed and was preparing to install a new mechanism when he felt something grip him. Not something, an invisible force that squeezed his body so tightly he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't cry out. The sensation lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, Johnson experienced pure terror. He described feeling a presence, malevolent and ancient, radiating negative energy, so intense it was almost physical. And then he saw the faces, not one but multiple, appearing on the cell walls around him, tortured expressions that seemed to be screaming though no sound emerged. One face in particular seemed to focus on him, beckoning, as if trying to draw him into whatever hell it inhabited. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The grip released. The faces vanished. Johnson found himself alone in the cell, shaking, his tools scattered on the floor where he dropped them. He left the cell block, and had to sit for a long time before he felt stable enough to continue working. He completed his locksmith work at Eastern State, but he never went back in his cell block 4. Johnson's experience became a touchstone for other reports. Here was a skilled tradesman, a person with no reason to fabricate stories, describing an encounter that went far beyond vague feelings or ambiguous sights. He'd been physically restrained by something invisible, had seen apparitions, had experienced genuine terror in a place where he should have felt nothing but professional detachment. His story gave permission, in a sense, for others to share their own experiences without fear of mockery. Other workers reported tools going missing and reappearing in impossible locations. Doors that had been locked would be found standing open. Temperature drops would occur in specific cells, localized cold spots where the air would suddenly be 30 or 40 degrees colder than the surrounding space, with no explanation from drafts or ventilation systems. The paranormal reputation of Eastern State Penitentiary caught the attention of professional ghost hunters and paranormal investigators. In the early 2000s, as the site opened to the public and began hosting special events, multiple paranormal television shows requested permission to film there. MTV's Fear brought contestants to Eastern State for challenges that involved spending time alone in the most reputedly haunted cell blocks. The show, while heavily produced and sensationalized, did capture some genuinely unsettling moments. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that seemed to follow patterns, failing in specific locations but working normally elsewhere. Contestants reported experiences that aligned with the historical accounts. Voices in Cell Block 12, shadows in Cell Block 6, faces in Cell Block 4. The Sci-Fi Channel's Ghost Hunters episode featuring Eastern State became one of the show's most watched installments. The team, using various detection equipment, recorded what they claimed were anomalous energy readings, temperature fluctuations, and, most dramatically, a shadowy figure caught on camera walking along a catwalk in Cell Block 4. The footage, while grainy and subject to multiple interpretations, showed what appeared to be a human-shaped shadow moving in a way that didn't correspond to any team member's position. The Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures crew spent a night at Eastern State and reported one of the most active paranormal investigations of their series. Multiple team members experienced physical sensations, mysterious sounds, and what they interpreted as intelligent responses to their questions during EVP, electronic voice phenomena, sessions. Skeptics, of course, have explanations for all of these phenomena. Old buildings make noises as they settle, and as temperature changes cause materials to expand and contract. Stone walls can create acoustic oddities where sounds seem to come from impossible directions. The human brain, especially when primed to expect supernatural experiences, can interpret ambiguous stimuli as confirming those expectations. Equipment can malfunction due to electromagnetic interference, battery issues, or simple defects. And in the case of television shows, there's always the possibility of manipulation or enhancement in post-production. These skeptical explanations are valid and important. Extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence, and grainy video footage or personal testimonies, no matter how sincere, don't constitute scientific proof of supernatural phenomena. But here's what makes Eastern State's haunting claims particularly interesting: the consistency. The same cell blocks are identified as paranormal hotspots by different people at different times, people who often have no knowledge of previous reports. The same types of phenomena, voices in 12, shadows in 6, faces in 4, are described independently by guards in the 1940s, urban explorers in the 1980s, restoration workers in the 1990s, and visitors in the 2000s. This consistency could suggest that something genuinely anomalous is occurring, or it could suggest that these particular cell blocks have physical properties that create sensory experiences people interpret as paranormal. Acoustic resonances, electromagnetic fields, infrasound, these are all well-documented phenomena that can affect human perception and create feelings of unease or even apparent hallucinations. There's also the power of expectation and story. Once a location becomes known as haunted, people visiting it are primed to interpret their experiences through that lens. A cold draft becomes a ghostly presence. An ambiguous sound becomes a disembodied voice. The history of suffering at the location provides a narrative framework into which these experiences can fit. One of the most compelling aspects of Eastern State's paranormal reputation is actually associated with Al Capone. During his incarceration, other prisoners reported hearing Capone crying out at night, begging someone named Jimmy to leave him alone. Capone himself, after his release, told associates that he was haunted by the ghost of James Clark, one of the victims of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Now, decades after Capone's death, visitors and staff report experiences in the recreated Capone cell. Some feel an oppressive presence, as if someone is standing very close to them. Others report hearing whispered words that sound like Jimmy, or feeling sudden, inexplicable sadness or fear when entering the cell. Skeptics would point out that everyone visiting this cell knows the Capone story. They're expecting to feel something unusual, so their minds manufacture experiences consistent with that expectation. But others argue that the consistency of the reported experiences and their alignment with accounts from Capone's actual incarceration decades earlier suggests something more than mere suggestion. The Eastern State Penitentiary Administration itself takes an interesting stance on the paranormal claims. They don't actively promote the site as haunted, preferring to focus on its historical and architectural significance. Tours don't emphasize ghost stories, though they acknowledge them. The institution has even stopped allowing overnight paranormal investigations, which were popular fundraisers but which they felt detracted from their educational mission. But they also don't dismiss the experiences people report. Staff members, even those skeptical of the supernatural, acknowledge that Eastern State has an atmosphere, a heaviness or unease that visitors frequently mention. Whether this atmosphere arises from the weight of history, from the knowledge of suffering that occurred here, from actual paranormal activity, or from some combination of all these factors, it's undeniably real to those who experience it. Perhaps the most thought-provoking aspect of Eastern State's haunting legends is what they reveal about our relationship with the past and with places of suffering. We want to believe that places where terrible things happen retain some mark of those events, that the pain and fear experienced by thousands of people over 142 years couldn't simply dissipate as if it never happened. The idea of ghosts at Eastern State is, in a sense, a way of acknowledging and honoring the suffering that occurred there. It says that the men who were driven mad by isolation, who were tortured by cruel punishments, who died in their cells far from their families, that these men matter, that their experiences left an indelible mark on this place. Whether that mark is supernatural or psychological, whether it's actual spirit presences or the residual emotional weight of history, it serves the same function. It prevents us from forgetting. As long as people report hearing voices in cell block 12, seeing shadows in cell block 6, feeling presences in cell block 4, we're forced to remember what happened here. The ghosts, real or imagined, won't let us forget. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Because remembering, confronting the difficult and uncomfortable truths about our history, that's essential if we're going to avoid repeating past mistakes. Eastern State Penitentiary stands as a testament to the dangers of even well-intentioned reforms when they're pushed to extremes, when ideology overrides humanity, when systems matter more than the people caught within them. Now let's see how this structure, haunted by ghosts or by history or by both, was saved from demolition and transformed into the museum and historic site that thousands visit each year. Preservation and rebirth. In 1988, when Mayor Wilson Goode halted the proposed redevelopment of Eastern State Penitentiary, he didn't just save a building. He set in motion a preservation project unlike almost anything attempted before. Because the challenge wasn't simply to restore Eastern State to some idealized past state. The challenge was to preserve it as a ruin, to stabilize it enough that it was safe for visitors while maintaining the atmosphere of decay that made it so evocative. This concept, stabilized ruin, became the guiding philosophy of the preservation effort. The Eastern State Penitentiary Task Force, working with preservation architects and structural engineers, developed a plan that walked a careful line. They would repair roofs to prevent further water damage. They would reinforce walls and floors that were in danger of collapse. They would remove hazards like loose masonry and unstable structures. But they wouldn't restore. They wouldn't return the prison to its appearance in 1829 or 1929 or any other specific date. They would preserve it as they found it, as a place where time had stopped and then begun moving backward through decay. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice, though the aesthetic considerations were important. It was also a practical one. Full restoration would have cost tens of millions of dollars, money that simply wasn't available. But more than that, the task force recognized that the decay itself told a story. The trees growing in exercise yards, the peeling paint, the crumbling plaster, these weren't defects to be corrected. They were evidence of what happens when society abandons even its grandest projects, when structures built to last forever are left to the mercy of time and nature. The early preservation work, funded by grants from the Pew Charitable Trusts and other philanthropic organizations, focused on the most urgent needs. Roofs were patched or replaced, particularly over the central hub and the main corridor of each cell block. This prevented further water infiltration, which was the primary cause of structural damage. Walls that were in danger of collapse were reinforced with steel bracing, visible but not intrusive, a reminder that this was an ongoing preservation effort, not a historical reconstruction. Then came the question of how to open the site to the public. The task force knew that Eastern State needed to generate revenue if it was going to survive long term. Preservation is expensive, and while grants could fund initial stabilization, ongoing maintenance would require steady income. The solution was to begin offering tours. The first tours, in 1994, were hard hat tours. Visitors were required to wear protective helmets and sign waivers acknowledging the risks of exploring a partially ruined structure. Groups were small and carefully supervised. The tours focused on the architecture and history, explaining the Pennsylvania system and showing visitors the various cell blocks in their states of decay. These initial tours were surprisingly popular. Eastern State wasn't the sanitized, fully restored historic site that most people expected from a museum. It was raw, authentic haunting. Visitors could see exactly how the prison had been left when it closed, could peer into cells still containing debris from decades of abandonment, could walk through corridors where paint peeled from walls and vegetation pushed through cracks in the floor. The success of the hard hat tours encouraged the task force to expand public access. But this required more extensive safety improvements. Walkways needed to be cleared and stabilized. Railings had to be installed in dangerous areas. Lighting was essential, not just for visibility, but to create atmosphere and guide visitors along safe routes while keeping them away from hazardous areas. In the early 2000s, Eastern State partnered with a production company to create an audio tour. The goal was to provide historical context and narrative structure while allowing visitors to explore at their own pace. For the narration, they approached Steve Buscemi, the actor known for both dramatic and comedic roles, but also for a distinctive voice that conveyed authenticity and empathy. Buscemi agreed, and his narration became one of Eastern State's signature features. He wasn't just reading historical facts. He was telling stories, bringing to life the experiences of prisoners, guards, and the reformers who had created the Pennsylvania system. He discussed the cruel punishments, the famous inmates, the daring escapes, and the complex legacy of a place built with good intentions that created so much suffering. Interspersed with Buscemi's narration were recordings from people who had actually lived or worked at Eastern State. Former guards recalling their experiences, former prisoners describing what incarceration felt like, historians and preservationists explaining the significance of what visitors were seeing. This multivocal approach created a rich, nuanced portrait of the prison that avoided simplistic narratives of good and evil. As Eastern State gained recognition as a historic site, it also attracted artists. The combination of dramatic architecture, historical significance, and an atmosphere of decay made it an ideal space for contemporary art installations. The task force embraced this, commissioning and hosting works that engaged with the site's history and with broader questions about incarceration, justice, and redemption. One early installation, placed in the central hub, consisted of speakers that played the voices of current and former inmates discussing their experiences in America's prison system. Visitors standing in the panoptic center of Eastern State, where guards had once observed every cell block simultaneously, heard the voices of people experiencing incarceration right now, connecting past and present, architectural history, and ongoing reality. Another installation in Cell Block 7 featured portraits of people currently incarcerated, their faces painted or photographed with dignity and humanity, forcing visitors to confront the fact that America's current prison population of over 2 million people aren't abstract statistics, but individuals, each with their own story. These art installations served multiple purposes. They generated media attention and attracted visitors who might not otherwise be interested in a historic prison. They created opportunities for dialogue about contemporary criminal justice issues, and they added layers of meaning to the site, making it not just a museum of the past, but a space for engaging with the present. As Eastern State's reputation grew, it began hosting special events. The most successful of these, which became an annual tradition and a major fundraiser, was Halloween nights. Every October, the prison would be transformed into an elaborate haunted house, with actors, special effects, and theatrical elements creating a horror experience that drew thousands of visitors. Halloween nights was controversial within the preservation community. Some argued that turning a historic site into a haunted house trivialized its history and played into the most sensational aspects of the prison's reputation. Others countered that the event was clearly labeled as entertainment, separate from the educational tours, and that the revenue it generated was essential for funding preservation work. The task force took the concerns seriously. They ensured that Halloween nights was marketed separately from the historic tours, that the haunted house elements were temporary installations that didn't damage the historic fabric, and that a portion of the profits went directly to preservation and educational programs. They also pointed out that Halloween nights introduced Eastern State to audiences who might never visit a historic site otherwise, and many of these visitors returned for daytime tours, curious to learn the real history behind the theatrical horror. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, preservation work continued. The synagogue, built in the 1920s and named for Alfred Fleischer, the board chairman who had championed its construction, was fully restored. This was one of the few areas where full restoration was appropriate, given the synagogue's historical and religious significance. The restoration included recreation of the decorative ceiling, installation of historically appropriate furnishings, and creation of exhibits explaining the role of Jewish prisoners and chaplains in the prison's history. Other restoration projects included the medical wing, which contained operating rooms, recovery wards, and a psychiatric unit from the prison's later years. These spaces were stabilized and open to the public, offering insights into how the prison dealt with physical and mental health issues among inmates. In 2012, Eastern State unveiled a major new exhibit titled Prisons Today: Questions in the Age of Mass Incarceration. This exhibit, positioned at the end of the standard tour route, confronted visitors with statistics and stories about America's current criminal justice system. It explored how the United States came to imprison a larger percentage of its population than any other nation, the racial disparities in incarceration rates, the challenges facing people trying to reintegrate into society after release, and the ongoing debates about prison reform. This exhibit was significant because it made explicit what had always been implicit in Eastern State's mission. This site isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how the past connects to the present, how the ideas that shaped the Pennsylvania system continue to influence criminal justice policy today, and how we might learn from historical mistakes to create better systems in the future. The exhibit also addressed an uncomfortable truth. While the Pennsylvania system's extreme isolation was abandoned as cruel and counterproductive, solitary confinement remains a common practice in American prisons. Hundreds of thousands of inmates spend time in isolation as punishment for rule violations or because they're considered security risks. The duration of this isolation can stretch into months or years, raising the same questions about psychological harm that Charles Dickens raised in 1842. Eastern State's willingness to engage with these contemporary issues distinguished it from many historic sites, which focus exclusively on their past. The institution positioned itself as a place for dialogue, for questioning, for confronting difficult truths about how society treats people who break its laws. In recent years, Eastern State has launched innovative programs that further this mission. The Returning Citizens Tour Guide program hires people who were formerly incarcerated to lead tours of the historic site. These guides bring unique perspectives, able to discuss prison conditions and the challenges of reentry with personal authority that professionally trained historians can't match. The program has won numerous awards and been featured in media around the world. It's also been genuinely transformative for the participants, providing employment, training, and a platform to share their experiences in ways that educate the public and advocate for reform. Eastern State has also developed extensive educational programs for students, including curriculum materials that teachers can use to explore topics ranging from architecture to civil rights to the criminal justice system. School groups tour the facility, engage with primary sources, and participate in discussions about justice, punishment, and rehabilitation. The organization has become a leader in what's called public history, the practice of making historical knowledge accessible and relevant to general audiences. Rather than simply presenting facts about the past, they create experiences that encourage visitors to think critically, to question assumptions, and to see connections between historical and contemporary issues. This approach has earned Eastern State recognition far beyond the preservation community. It's been honored by the American Alliance of Museums, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and numerous other organizations. More importantly, it's become a model for how historic sites can remain relevant and meaningful in the 21st century. Today, Eastern State Penitentiary attracts over 200,000 visitors annually. They come from across the United States and around the world, drawn by the architecture, the history, the art, the paranormal reputation, or simply curiosity about this unusual place. And what they find is a complex, layered experience that resists simple categorization. You can visit Eastern State as a tourist, taking selfies in front of Al Capone's cell and marveling at the Gothic architecture. You can visit as a history buff, examining the details of John Haviland's radial design and learning about the Pennsylvania system's influence on prisons worldwide. You can visit as an art enthusiast, engaging with contemporary installations that use the space to explore themes of confinement and freedom. You can visit as someone concerned about criminal justice, learning about how the past informs present policies and what might be done differently. Or you can visit simply to experience the atmosphere, to walk through these ruined corridors and feel the weight of everything that happened here. To stand in a cell and imagine spending years in that small space, alone with only your thoughts and your Bible. To look up at the Gothic towers and understand how architecture can be used to intimidate and inspire. To recognize that this place, for all its strangeness, tells us something important about who we are and who we've been. The preservation of Eastern State Penitentiary is ongoing. Stone continues to crumble. Roofs continue to leak. Nature continues to reclaim small victories, pushing roots through cracks, sending vines up walls. The battle against decay is never won, only fought to a standstill. But that's appropriate. A stabilized ruin acknowledges that nothing lasts forever, that all our grandest projects eventually return to dust, but that the interval between creation and destruction can be extended, honored, and made meaningful. Eastern State stands today, as it has for nearly 2 centuries, a massive stone structure in the heart of Philadelphia. But it's no longer a prison. It's a memorial, a museum, a question, an invitation to confront uncomfortable truths and to imagine better futures. The silence that once drove men mad now invites contemplation. The isolation that was punishment now creates space for reflection. And the walls that were meant to separate criminals from society now bring people together to grapple with difficult questions about justice, humanity, and redemption. As you drift towards sleep, let the image of Eastern State settle in your mind. Those towering Gothic walls, those long corridors lit by skylights, those small cells where men counted out their days in solitude. Think about the good intentions that created this place and the suffering that resulted. Think about the famous criminals who walked these halls and the forgotten thousands whose stories were never recorded. Think about the guards who worked here, caught between duty and conscience. Think about the reformers who believed they were building something revolutionary, and the critics who saw only cruelty. Eastern State Penitentiary is many things, but perhaps most of all, it's a reminder that the past isn't really past. It echoes through the present in ways both obvious and subtle. The debates about how to treat criminals, about punishment versus rehabilitation, about isolation versus community, these debates didn't end when Eastern State closed in 1971. They continue, and the questions raised by this extraordinary building remain as urgent and unresolved as they were nearly 2 centuries ago. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the Eastern State Penitentiary, this extraordinary structure that has served as a prison, a ruin, and now a monument and museum. We passed through its Gothic entrance, explored its circular cell blocks, met its famous inmates, and witnessed its evolution from a revolutionary institution to an overcrowded warehouse, an abandoned ruin, and a preserved landmark. We saw how good intentions can lead to unexpected suffering, how architecture profoundly shapes the human experience, and how spaces can bear the weight of history, becoming more than just buildings, repositories of collective memory and enduring questions. As you drift off to sleep tonight, Perhaps you will dream of the stone corridors illuminated by skylights, the small cells with vaulted ceilings, the sounds echoing in the empty halls. Perhaps you will contemplate the fine line between justice and cruelty, rehabilitation and punishment, isolation and community. Or perhaps you will let the story envelop you, like another thread in the vast fabric of human history. Before I go, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysteries of history and architecture, don't forget to subscribe to Mystic Sleep Tales. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any episodes. From ancient mysteries to modern riddles, from haunted places to fascinating historical figures, we have many more stories to explore together. And please, take a moment to leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It makes me so happy to see how far these stories reach. Also, let me know if there are any stories, places, or historical mysteries you'd like me to cover in future episodes. Your suggestions help guide us on this journey together into the dark corners of the past. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that the echoes of history are all around us, waiting to be heard by those willing to listen. And remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.